Hi, it's so good to see you again. Today's topic is the many definitions of rhetoric. Usually, on the first day of class, the teacher will spend some time defining the subject of study. Biology is the study of life. Astronomy is the study of stars. Painting is, well, the study of painting. Day one of any class is typically the day to make sure that everybody knows what that class is going to be about. But that's not what the first day of my first rhetoric class was like. Right at the beginning of that semester, the professor handed out a sheet of paper with a list of definitions of rhetoric, and they were all different. Now, how's that for a first day introduction to a subject? Far from finding that frustrating, though, I found the myriad definitions of rhetoric fascinating. And even though it was clear that people had struggled for thousands of years to put rhetoric ironically into words, I also began to see that rhetoricians were a group of people who saw the world in the same way that I did, and a way that I myself had struggled to put into words. So for some disciplines, a single definition is enough to tell you what that discipline is all about. For rhetoric, though, the multiplicity of definitions tells us more about the field of study than any single definition could on its own. With that in mind, then, I want to spend some time today talking about some major definitions of rhetoric, but I also want to discuss the reason for and value of having so many different definitions for the same thing. And of course, it wouldn't be YouTube if I didn't ask you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. If you're interested in learning more about rhetoric in order to improve your writing, be sure to subscribe so that you won't miss out on all the fun that lies ahead. And away we go. So, what is rhetoric? Well, of course, it depends on who you ask. Aristotle said that rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. For Aristotle, rhetoric was the art of knowing what would be persuasive in any particular situation. Because of that, Aristotle's writing on rhetoric involved detailed catalogs of emotions, topics, and more. His goal was to explain how persuasion worked by describing all of the things that a speaker could do to persuade an audience. With such an impressive list of possibilities in your head, then, you would be able to know what would work in a particular situation and then do it. Now, that definition is pretty different from Quintilian's, an ancient Roman rhetorician and educator who said that rhetoric is the art of speaking well. And he was careful to point out that an orator had to be a good man, skilled in speaking. So for Quintilian, rhetoric was not just about discovering persuasive possibilities, it was also about the development of moral character. Quintilian seemed to have been sensitive to the possibility that rhetoric could be used for manipulative or nefarious purposes, so his definition of rhetoric and the people who used it also included an emphasis on using rhetorical knowledge for good. I.A. Richards called rhetoric the study of misunderstandings and their remedies, emphasizing the reality of human disagreement and the role that rhetoric plays to help us to work through those disagreements in nonviolent and constructive ways. Friend of the show Kenneth Burke once said that rhetoric was the use of words by human agents to form attitudes or to induce actions in other human agents. Now, this might sound like a pretty abstract way of saying that rhetoric is just what people do to persuade each other, but Burke's definition reflects a lot of his own preoccupations. He was very invested in understanding why people do what they do and how symbols defined and influenced human action. So it's really no surprise that symbols and agents would feature prominently in his definition. They were the aspects of rhetoric that he was most interested in figuring out. And it's not uncommon for rhetoricians to define rhetoric in a way that emphasizes the aspects of rhetoric that they're most interested in understanding. Thomas Rickert, for example, was interested in the ways that the environment shapes human action and the role that rhetoric plays in calling our attention to the world in particular ways when he defined rhetoric like this. Rhetoric is a responsive way of revealing the world for others, responding to and put forth through affective, symbolic, and material means, so as to, at least potentially, reattune or otherwise transform how others inhabit the world to an extent that calls for some action. In other words, rhetoric is something that causes people to see the world in a different way, which then leads them to do something in response. Now, Kenneth Burke was not interested in the environment in the same way that Rickert was, so it's not surprising that their working definitions of rhetoric would reflect that difference in focus. Of course, definitions of rhetoric don't always have to aim for really specific technical distinctions. Andrea Lunsford has defined rhetoric as the art, practice, and study of human communication. If you, like me, took high school English with a copy of Lunsford's Everything's an Argument, then you saw firsthand how broad her understanding of rhetoric could be. For Aristotle, rhetoric was a specialized art of knowing in a particular situation what would be persuasive. For Lunsford, rhetoric includes anything and everything that people do to communicate. Rhetoric is about arguments, and everything's an argument, so rhetoric is everything. But we can get even broader. Richard Weaver has defined rhetoric as cognate with language, so forget specific persuasive situations, free yourself from the need for complex ethical training, and quit worrying about whether communication is even happening or not. For Weaver, rhetoric happens wherever language happens, plain and oh so comprehensively simple. Now, while you might get a different definition of rhetoric from every person that you ask, that doesn't mean that rhetoric is impossible to understand. For all the differences that these definitions have, they have a lot more in common, and they're all still defining the same thing. It's not, in other words, like some people are defining rhetoric while others are defining psychology. Rhetoric is complex and difficult to define, but it's not unknowable. Even when rhetoricians have different technical definitions of rhetoric, they're all working from the same understanding of rhetoric and what it is. So we're better served by looking at what these definitions have in common than by getting hung up on their differences. So you may have already caught some of the commonalities among these many definitions, but let's talk about the fundamental aspects of rhetoric that are shared among most, if not all, definitions of rhetoric. The first is real-world situations. When we're working with rhetoric, we're working in real life. Rhetoricians aren't really trying to figure out what is cosmically or eternally true. Of course, that kind of big T truth does play a part in the rhetorical process, but rhetoricians are generally more concerned with more practical things. That is, rhetoric doesn't happen in theory, it happens in practice, and that shows up in a lot of these definitions. Secondly, we often see rhetoric working to unify people with differing perspectives. We don't really need rhetoric where everyone agrees or where opinions don't matter. So you're not going to need rhetoric to help you to persuade somebody that ice is cold, and no amount of persuasive dialogue is going to convince somebody to like the taste of cilantro. In the first case, people already agree, and in the second case, no amount of talking is going to change the way that somebody perceives different flavor compounds. In all other cases, though, rhetoric can be really useful. And so rhetoric and its definitions reflect the process of unifying people who see the world in different ways. Thirdly, definitions of rhetoric include symbolic interventions, usually but not always through language. You can see that in political speeches and articles, but you can also see rhetoric at work in the way that people dress or in the images that are put into shop windows. In fact, when I was in college, we spent a class period talking about rhetoric in architecture. The humanities building had been designed with lots of windows as a way of representing that the building was full of the light of truth and knowledge. So you can see that rhetoricians are all talking about the same basic concept, even when their definitions differ in the details. Now, if you remember our earlier discussions on semantic and poetic meaning, this wide range of definitions for rhetoric might frustrate some people who insist that every word must have only one definition. But that semantic ideal is both limited and limiting. And the fact of the matter is that we can get a much more comprehensive understanding of rhetoric when we give up trying to pin it down to a single definition and instead embrace them all. Now, it's easy to provide a single definition for things that don't really matter that much. Quasars, iambic pentameter, beta-carotene. The more technical and removed from human experience we get, the easier things are to define. But definition gets harder when we deal with things that matter to us very much. Love, fear, happiness, the good life, faith, sadness, honor. Quasars are so far removed from our daily experience that the definition of the word quasar doesn't have to intersect with our personal and political dramas. But faith, on the other hand, weaves itself through the daily experiences of countless people with innumerable degrees of religious devotion, and because of that, faith resists definition in a way that the word quasar just doesn't. No two people experience life or faith in the same way, and so there are bound to be many different definitions for the word faith. And the same is true for rhetoric. At its core, rhetoric is deeply human. Like fear or love, rhetoric is something that we experience more than define. Like virtue or vice, rhetoric is inextricable from the day-to-day human experience. Every individual person has their own ideals. That is, everyone has their own vision for how the world should be. And at the same time, everybody is forced to confront the reality of how the world actually is. Rhetoric is the thing that bridges the gap between our ideals and our reality. When we confront people and situations that don't match up with our expectations, Rhetoric is the thing that helps us to figure out what to do next so that we can all go on living our lives. When we practice rhetoric properly, we're not trying to outsmart our enemies or own our adversaries. Instead, we're trying to understand the ideals of other people, to appreciate how their values differ from and resonate with our own, and then to figure out a way of moving forward to create a reality that we can all be comfortable with. We cannot persuade if our audience doesn't feel understood and valued, and we cannot ask others to compromise if we're not willing to do so ourselves. Rhetoric, then, is the thing that helps us to resolve our disputes without violence. It's the thing that helps us to achieve our grandest aspirations without coercion. Rhetoric helps us to transcend our differences and to leverage our commonalities so that we can accomplish great things. So of course rhetoric is difficult to define, but that difficulty only reflects the beautiful complexity of what it means to be a human living alongside other humans. We have marvelous linguistic and symbolic resources at our disposal that enable us to live and work and progress together as we reconcile our varied ideals with our shared reality. And that is what rhetoric is all about. So go out there and use your rhetorical powers for good, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.